Hello, Emile here. So this is Cold Metal Classics number 7, and I want to talk about a band that this one's not so obscure. People know about this band, but nobody seems to talk about this album. So today, talking about the Cromags, and they started out in the punk scene, and their claim to fame is their punk stuff, their early punk stuff. But even in these early punk days, their first album that was in the 80s, I think their first album finally came out in was it 84 or 86, called The Age of Quarrel. But they were doing shows and everything even before that with demos that they had in 85. That got reissued called Before the Quarrel. But their like a landmark album that everyone talks about is a punk album called The Age of Quarrel, and even that is highly influenced by metal, like metalized distortion, and there's definitely some metal influences even on the early Cromags. So it was tagged hardcore punk, but it definitely has a metal influence, even all of their stuff. And then their second album, Best Wishes, that was a thrash album, and I think that one was 89 or 90. And the album we're talking about today came out in 1992, Alpha Omega 3. And so the first album was hardcore punk with the metal influence. Then the second album, Best Wishes, was a thrash album. And then this is their third album, but their second thrash album called Alpha Omega 3 from 1992. And the lineup here is John Joseph on vocals, also known as Blood Clot John Joseph. Really amazing singer with a lot of power in his voice. Hardy Flanagan on bass and backing vocals. Doug Holland on guitars. And during this period of band, they brought in a new guitarist named Gabby Abdulrak. So he's the guitar team of Doug Holland, who's always been in Cromags, and they got rid of one of their guitarists, Perry, and added Gabby Abdulrak on guitars. And you definitely hear a difference on this album with the guitars. You hear a really jazz influence on the guitars, especially on the leads on this. And maybe that's Gabby or maybe that's Doug, I'm not sure, but maybe it's the addition of Gabby Abdulrak. And Dave DiCenzo on drums. So, alright, now let's talk about some of this stuff. Now this album, what makes this album so great to me, Alpha Omega, what makes this a really standout album, period, in the thrash scene, is, and bands like this, Cromags, and other bands like DRI and Suicidals, at first they played punk and then they started doing thrash. A lot of them get tagged crossover, but to me this is, even all the Suicidal stuff I would call it thrash. The DRI stuff I would call it thrash, and even this I would call it thrash. To me, the stuff I would call crossover would be like Agnostic Front's 90s, early 90s stuff, because it's not exactly thrash, but it's not, it was punk, but it had so much metal in it that it's now something different. I would call that crossover. But this is pure thrash with a jazzy influence, and here's what makes this album stand out to me. I hate jazz. I am not a fan of jazz at all. And this is metal with a jazz influence, and it's really good, something original, and I like it. And I know that it's jazz, and I hate jazz, and this came out really good. So it's an exception for me. And another thing, there's a song on here called The Eyes of Tomorrow, which has a big rap influence, and I absolutely hate rap. I despise rap, and I think probably most of the people that are coming to my channel, metal fans coming to my channel, I think most of you probably feel the same way. They don't like rap at all. But this song, Eyes of Tomorrow, is rap influence, and it's actually one of the highlights of the album. It's not Limp Bizkit or anything like this. Like, it doesn't ruin the album. It's actually one of the highlights of the album. It's a really good song. So John Joseph is still singing on this. He makes his singing parts rhyme and does almost like a rap cadence, but you can't completely call it rapping because there's still some singing in there. Like what he's doing is not totally rapping and it's not totally singing. It's like something in the middle there, on that song. And there's a little bit of scratching DJ thing on there that they threw in there that give it more of a rap flavor, but it's still a thrash song. It's still a thrash song and it still sounds really good. It's one that they did different. You gotta remember, this is from '92. This is how you know that thrash was coming to an end. Even in the late '80s, I would say from about '88 through the mid '90s, you had two camps. You had one camp of thrashers that was still trying to break the speed limit and be as heavy and fast and dark as possible, especially fast. They all became death metal. All those bands became death thrash, right? So that's one camp of thrashers from, I would say, about '88 on into the '90s. You had the people that were trying to out-extreme everybody, that group of thrashers, which became death metal, thrash death. And then you had another camp. You had two more camps. You had one camp that was going proggy, it was like progressive thrash, and even them were mixed up in that death metal camp too. And then you had another camp that was trying to be pure '80s thrash, and they were experimenting with weird stuff. Almost all of them had like a funk song on their album, and maybe a rap song on their album. Like Anthrax did it with the I'm the Man. Suicidal Tendencies really started that funk thing with Lovely, and they're really known for that. Suicidal Tendencies, for that funk stuff, but they weren't the only ones. I could name at least like 10 thrash albums with a funk song on there that was coming out at the time, and there was a bunch of them doing like a one rap influenced song too. A bunch of the thrash bands were doing this in the late '80s, early '90s, and that's how you could tell that thrash was really on its way out. The pure thrashers were all trying to experiment with funk and rap, and I think maybe Suicidals made that popular, but even where that came from with them, it came from, was it like Chili Peppers and Faith No More kind of influence on metal, right? Why they were doing all the funk stuff. And people liked, I guess, some of the thrashers. They wanted to experiment with rap. That's how you get Anthrax, I'm the Man, Cromags, Eyes of Tomorrow, and there's a few other out there I can't remember off the top of my head, but a bunch of those late '80s, early '90s thrash albums had that funk rap experimentation on at least one song on the album. And the pure thrashers would always have that one off-the-wall song in that period, and then everybody else was going on to death metal. So that's kind of how you knew that thrash was on its way out. And then you had other people that, after Pantera came out, went on to do groove, right? Everybody started doing groove for a minute. So this is one of those early '90s thrash albums, the end of the thrash period with the experimentation. You got a rap song on here, a little thrash rap song on here, or whatever, but it's good. I don't like Anthrax's I'm the Man at all. but I like this. I don't like Limp Bizkit or any of those rap metal bands, anything like that. I can't stand it. I don't like it at all. But this, it was actually done pretty good. It still stayed metal with just a little bit of rap in there. And I hate jazz. There's a big jazz influence on the guitars all over the place on this album, and it came out good. So that's why this album is such an exception to me. They were doing something really different in thrash, and things that I wouldn't even want someone to do. You know, genres that I hate, like jazz and rap, and it came out good. It came out good and really original, and John Joseph's vocals, really powerful, badass vocals by John Joseph. Another thing, okay, at the end of this album, after the last song, there's a period of silence for a few minutes, and then there's a hidden medley, a hidden solo, guitar solo medley on there that's really hear the jazz influence in it. And it doesn't sound like it, I don't know why, but it reminds me of, there's a solo like that after Pantera's Floods, right? I'm pretty sure it was right after the song Floods on the Great Southern Trendkill album by Pantera. They had a badass solo that Dime did on there like that. This solo kind of reminds me of that, but this solo is jazz flavored. And even though I despise jazz, this is really good. This is really good. Don't miss this hidden track on there, instrumental. It's a highlight. It's a highlight. So those things that me personally, I would think wouldn't work, and I don't like on their own, and I wouldn't want mixed with my metal, the Cromags did it on this album, and it came out good. You know, so that's why this is such a original and landmark album to me. Most of the time when people experiment with stuff that I don't like, I just don't like it, period. You know? I usually hate when people do that. And somehow, I mean, Cromags gave me what I didn't want, and I liked it. That's why this album is so good to me. So, there it is there. And also, their second album, Best Wishes, is a thrash album, which is pretty good too, but it's not as original as this. And that hardcore punk album from '86, Age of Coral, is pretty good too. So those first three albums by them are pretty much classic albums, but this one stands out the most to me as being the most original. And just a really original thrash album for the thrashers out there, instead of just like a whole bunch of underground thrash bands that sound almost exactly the same. This one definitely, it's straight from the herd. You know, this straight is from the pack. Like this, you hear this album, Alpha Omega 3, and it does not sound like every other thrash band for sure. Very original. So there it is there. Mila signing out. Check out Cromags, Alpha Omega 3. Tell me, what do you guys think of Cromags? All the punk rockers know who Cromags are, but nobody talks about their thrash albums, especially not this one. What about their metal period? You know, what about their thrash period? It's not stuff to just scoff at. It's really good original. Their metal period is really good too. Why people only focus on the punk stuff with them and ignore the metal stuff with them, when the metal stuff is really good. So there it is there. Let me know what you think about this album. Check it out, and I'll be back with another classic. I'll hit you guys with something more obscure next time, I promise. All right, so that's it.